You've probably already heard of Jean Piaget in an earlier psychology course, but a few fun facts about him. He published his first scientific paper at the age of 10, and when he was employed at the Binet Institute in the 1920s, his job was to develop the French version of the English intelligence test. This is where he had the opportunity to also observe children and how they did on various cognitive tasks that involve logic and reasoning. So, this brings us to his greatest contribution in understanding cognitive development. Before Piaget, scientists and researchers really just thought children were less competent adults, so miniature adults with less competent skills, versus Piaget really showed in his four stage model that children's thinking are strikingly different from adults and sometimes from one another. So if you think about infants, how they view the world, how they make sense of it, is strikingly different from a 3 or 4 year old versus student elementary school versus an adolescent in teenage years. There's two videos I will link at the end of the video and also within your module that you should feel free to check out. One is a YouTube video on Piaget's overall contribution to developmental psychology and an overview of his four-stage cognitive development. And then there's another one similar to that, but goes into more depth on each stage. That one's on Khan Academy. So be sure to check those two videos out. Piaget dedicated his life to answer this one central question, which is how does a child's knowledge of the world change with age? His assumption is that children are active participants in making sense of the world and constructing his or her own knowledge of what's happening around them. Remember in chapter one when we were talking about developmental psychology and the main questions that theorists try to answer? One of them is this theory stage like or is it more continuous? So, are you just growing from a small tree to a bigger tree, or do you go from a caterpillar to butterfly? So, something that's qualitatively different. Well, Piaget falls into this camp where he sees development in this discrete, qualitatively different stages of development in terms of cognitive changes. And his theory are universal. So that means whether you grew up in Africa or Asia or in the United States, Piaget assumes you go through similar stages of development based on your age. So, to fully understand Piaget's theory, we have to talk about scheme or schema. These are basic actions of categorizing our experiences in the world. So, think about a baby shortly after birth as he opens his eyes and sees mom and dad for the first time or sees the ceiling of the delivery room. He has developed something called looking schema. And then once he hears his own cry, he develops the hearing schema as he hears that cry or hears mom and dad talk. So, any kind of sensory experiences that the baby's first exposed to, those begin to form his basic kind of building blocks of knowing. And then as the baby grows older, he or she might develop walking schema, climbing schema, running schema, or touching the ball schema, whatever those experiences become. This brings us to a concept that Piaget calls organization. So he believes that each of us are born with this ability to go from very specific stimuli or schema to a more generalizable experience. So, to give an example of this, a baby might see um, an object that moves for the first time, like a dog, and then sees mom pointing at the dog saying, "This is a puppy," or "This is a dog." Then baby is using this combination of looking schema, seeing what the dog looks like, hearing schema, hearing what sounds the dog is making and the label mom is giving them to start forming the schema of what a dog looks like. And then later on, as he sees more types of dogs, so different colors of dog, different sizes of dogs, different brands of dogs, um, he's able to kind of form this concept of what a dog is through his various type of schema. And then the next time he's able to go from um, hearing a dog bark, even though he's never seen this type of dog visually, he's able to say, okay, based on the schemas that I know, this is a dog. So organization is going from very specific experience to where you can generalize and kind of pinpoint the same type of objects. This also brings us to a specific types of schema called figurative schema. So the baby is able to know that this is a dog, maybe based on different characteristics like the dog barks or wags his tail or has two ears and looks a certain type of way. So figurative schema is where babies or children have basic understanding of the properties associated with objects in the world versus something called operative schema. This is where children are able to form logical connections between different objects. So, for instance, the baby might or the child might know an apple is a fruit. A fruit is something that you can eat. To drawing this logical connection, because apple is a fruit and fruit is something you can eat, apple is something that you can eat. So, making logical connections of different categories and the connections between them. This is called operative schema. So let's talk about how schema fits into the grander scheme of cognitive development and how children make sense of things. We'll talk about assimilation and accommodation. So, assimilation is when we're able to put our new experiences and fit it into what we already know about the world or existing schema. So, for instance, a 2-year-old sees a man who's bald on top of his head and has long frizzy hair on the side and decides to point at this man and calls him clown, clown, because he has seen clowns before who are bald on top of their heads and have frizzy long hair. So in this boy's head, he has reached equilibrium, as you kind of see on the scale, because everything makes sense. I'm able to fit this new experience into what I already know. So everything is in balance, everything is good in my world. However, the father is really horrified because this bold man with long frizzy hair really isn't a clown. So the father decides to explain to the child, even though his hair is like a clown's, he's not wearing a funny costume and wasn't doing silly things to make you laugh. So now the boy reaches something called disequilibrium because now things don't make as much sense as it did a few seconds ago. So, in order to accommodate and make sense of this new experience, the boy has to develop this new schema to make sense of things. So go back to what we talked about figurative schema. So a boy now knows different characteristics that's associated with a clown. So bald on top of his head, has frizzy hair on the sides, wears funny costumes, and make people laugh. So he's using his figurative schema and says, okay, because this man right in front of me is not making me laugh, he's wearing regular clothes, therefore he's not a clown, he's just a regular man. So he's using his figurative schema to draw that conclusion. And once he does that, he's able to maybe reach assimilation to know, okay, there are two types of men in the world, clowns and non-clowns. And when people don't wear funny costumes and make me laugh, they're not clowns. And then the boy reaches equilibrium again. Okay, so I hope that makes you able to understand the process of equilibrium, disequilibrium, and how assimilation, which is fitting a new experience or new stimuli into our existing schema, and accommodation is making way to make sense of these new things. Okay? So let's talk about causes of cognitive development. Before I talk about what Piaget believed to be the four causes of cognitive development, what do you think makes your cognitions different than that of an infant or an child or an adolescent? What are the factors that contribute to our growth over the years? feel free to pause and think about it for a little bit. Think about how you are different now than you were at 15 or 7 or 2, and what contributes to those differences. For Piaget, he listed four. The first one is equilibration. This is an inborn automatic response that all humans have to make sense of things when there's challenges in the environment that doesn't fit in quite nicely with what they already know or the existing schema. So, a nice example would be in the previous slide when we talked about assimilation and accommodation. So when a child sees a man that resembles what he knows to be a clown, but turns out to not be a clown, he reaches disequilibration or disequilibrium, that he would want to make sense of things. So in that example, the dad provided new information about what clowns are or what they aren't. Then after making sense of things, oh, because the man that I just sees is not wearing a funny costume or is not making me laugh, then he reaches equilibrium again because he now knows a little bit more about clowns and non-clowns. So he's able to kind of reach this cognitive balance. The second one is brain development on its own. So if you think back to chapter 1, Aslan's model of environmental influences, he would call this maturation. The brain would just develop on its own as we age. Obviously, there might be some inborn differences as to how quickly brain might develop for one person versus another. There's also environmental differences, such as the nutrition one receives, or sleep, or exercise, or factors such as schooling, family, your community, your culture, that might play a role in how fast or slow your brain develops at a particularly given age. But the brain would develop on its own, assuming it gets adequate um, things to sustain itself. The third one would be social transmission. So this is information they get from other people. So I'm going to use that clown information again. So if the dad wasn't really familiar with how clowns work, then he's not able to provide that information. So you might be, oh, I don't know what those are. Let's go and find out. Or I don't know what the man is. Or he might just point at the man and say, yep, that's a clown. Then he's giving the wrong type of information. So we learn from the information we get from others, whether it's right or wrong. The fourth type of information is experiences. So think about the infant who was just born. He's learning from experiences of the looking schema, the touching schema, the hearing schema, to when he or she is a little bit older, then they have different experiences of walking, talking. All those different types of schema are derived from experiences, and we learn from our experiences and make sense of the world from them. So all of this combined together are causes to cognitive development. So, in this slide, I'll briefly go over Piaget's four stages of cognitive development. Be sure to check out the videos within the modules on YouTube and Khan Academy to get a much more visual sense of the different developmental tasks Piaget had set out to test these children way back when. Okay, so the first stage is sensory motor. This is from birth and 18 months. And when you kind of think about children to early young toddlerhood, they're really just able to use their sensory and motor skills, so sensory motor, to physically manipulate, act, and experience the world. So when you kind of think about babies at that young age, they're learning to touch, they're learning to crawl, to walk, maybe to run a little bit, jump up and down. That's how they're learning and making sense of the world. Second stage, pre-operational stage. This is from 18 months to 6 years of age. This is when young children you're using more symbolic thinking, such as language, pretend play. So think about this as more symbols and where their cognition gets a little bit more complicated. They're learning to talk, they're learning to play, to interact with the world, they're getting a lot more social, but they're not really thinking logically necessarily, which is the next stage, which is concrete operations. This is from age 6 to preteen, around 12 years of age. They're able to think more rationally, use more logic. This is also corresponding with kind of school age children where they're learning more um, task oriented things. The fourth stage is called formal operational stage. This is during adolescence and beyond. This is when children develop the ability to manipulate hypothetical concepts and abstract reasoning. So, when you kind of think about this, I typically associate this stage with like algebra or philosophy. This is where thinking gets a lot more complex. So, they're able to think about hypothetical scenarios and things are a lot more complicated. So, a lot of times, even we say this stage occurred during adolescence, a lot of adults even, especially for those that don't uses these hypothetical abstract more complex thinking, they don't necessarily reach this stage. So let's talk about egocentrism. This is something that occurs in Piaget's pre-operational, so their preschool age, where children only sees the world from their own perspective and can't really see it from another's perspective. So you can say they're rather self-centered at that point. A famous test would be the three mountain test. So, what Piaget would set out doing is set up three different mountains of three different height. And when you look at these mountains from different angle, you'd see different things. So, what Tommy sees from his seat right now is different from the opposite side where the clown or the doll would see. So, what Piaget would do is invite Tommy to maybe walk around into the four um, corners or the four sides of the mountain and then say, describe to me what you see here, describe to me what you see here, describe to me what you see here. So, and then invite Tommy to go back to his own original seat. By that point, Tommy would have seen what the clown or the dog could see from that perspective, which is a small mound, a middle mound, and then a big mountain follow that. But from Tommy's current seat, he could only see the big mountain and then the rest would kind of be covered. So at that point, Piaget would ask Tommy to draw a picture of what he thinks the doll would see. Even though Tommy has seen that, he would probably, if he's of a preschool age or young school age, he would probably only draw the big mountain because that's what he's seeing currently, and he believes the doll would see exactly what he's seeing. Pretty interesting, isn't it? During pre-operational stage, one of the things that children develop is this concept of conservation. Conservation is the understanding that a quantity or the amount of a substance remains the same, even though the shape might look different or the arrangement might be different. An example of this would be have two of the same container and then same amount of blue water in both of them. Ask a 4 to 5 year old, um, are they the same? Are they different? Which one has more? She will probably tell you they look the same, they're the same. And then take a tall but narrower glass and then pour one of the containers into this tall, narrower glass. And then ask again, now that I've poured it into this new container, which one has more water? Is it this one, the tall one, or is this shorter one? Most children, if they haven't developed conservation, they would point at the taller glass thinking because it is taller, it looks like it has more water. However, if a child has developed conservation, he or she will tell you they're both the same. So this also brings us to this concept of centration versus decentration. Centration is when you're only able to consider one variable at a time versus decentration, you're able to consider multiple things at once. So for the child who hasn't developed conservation, he or she is probably only seeing the height of the glass. They're not seeing the height of the glass while also considering, but the person in front of me just poured it out of the same glass as the shorter glass. So when children are able to consider multiple variables at once, they've reached decentration. So, Piaget's research involved several types of conservation tasks. He would classify children's thinking as concrete operational with respect to a particular task if they can correctly solve the problem and provide a concrete operational reason for their answer. So, for instance, look at the first task, which is called conservation of numbers. So, you take six of the marbles, place them in front of a child, and then you take the exact six marbles and then move them out a little bit, like the second picture, which is on the left. So they're the same amount of marbles, but they're just more spaced out. He would then ask the child, are they the same? Have they changed? If a child is able to say the two circles or marbles are exactly the same because you didn't take away any, you didn't add away any when you moved them, then the response would be judged as concrete operational. Versus if you might have asked the child, are they the same? Are they different? Which one has more? Then they say, the two circles are the same. I don't know why. Or they would point at the second one and say, that's more. Then that response would not be classified as concrete operational. You can find the list of these tasks and figures in your textbook in page 144. So be sure to check that out and read more about this. If you've ever talked to a child on the phone, you may have encountered the situation shown here on the slide. Denzel hasn't figured out that he needs to give his dad extra information about what he's doing because dad can't see what he's holding. Denzel just thinks his dad can see and think exactly the same thing as he does. So, this understanding that people don't share the same thoughts and feelings as you do, that develops over childhood, and this is called the theory of mind. Another way to think about this is to think about this as the child's ability to tune in to other people's perspective. So, again, going back to egocentrism, this kind of develops hand in hand with once the child outgrows egocentrism, his or her theory of the mind probably is able to develop much better. This ability doesn't really emerge overnight, but it develops in a predictable order after a certain age. Can you think about why developing theory of the mind is really significant developmentally beyond cognition? So, in addition to Piaget's theory, there are other theorists that have come up with models of cognitive development. One example would be Ziegler's wave theory. So, you can find more description of this in page 151 of your textbook. A lot of theorists have described this as a better description of the way children move towards more complex form of thinking than step-like stages that Piaget originally proposes. Um, Looking at the graph here, you would see strategy 1 and strategy 2 utilizes at a much younger age versus strategy 5 is more commonly used in older children or maybe adolescents. Um, if you kind of overlap Sealer's theory with Piaget's theory, you would probably find that children in Piaget's sensory motor stage uses probably strategy 1 and maybe strategy 2 a lot more often, and they have not developed strategy 5. The difference between Ziegler and Piaget is it's not that these strategies are mutually exclusive. Um, During older age, according to Ziegler, children might use strategy 1 and strategy 2 a lot less, but it doesn't mean it doesn't occur at all. It just means they're less common. So we're not just talking about one thing, one very distinct stage versus another. We all use these strategies. It just depends on how commonly used these are. So, to wrap up our lecture, I want to offer an additional slide connecting the content of what we've talked about related to cognitive development and put into the bigger context of children's development in general and a real life scenario. So, for some of you, you may have children that is kindergarten age or has been in kindergarten or may know a child within the family or a close friend that is of that age. How do we assess for kindergarten readiness? A lot of time, age is kind of the determination of whether or not a child gets sent to kindergarten. However, is that really the best practice of using age? Even though Tommy and Jane are both 5 year olds, how may they be different cognitive development wise or other areas of development that may make one not ready for kindergarten? So, I'd encourage you to think about what are developmental skills and maturity you think are needed or required for a child to be successful entering kindergarten. How should we assess for that readiness other than age? And if you think about it from an ecological contextual angle, what are the factors that might impact their readiness for school? Um, Feel free to do some research on this next question or just going from your gut. What do you think are the implications of redshirting for families of different economic background and children of different gender? So, redshirting, for those of you who may not be familiar with this, it's a term that came from football that got translated into the academic world. It's the practice of postponing entrance into kindergarten for age eligible children in order to allow extra time for emotional, social, and intellectual or physical growth. So, for instance, if a state's kindergarten cutoff is September 1st, a child may be born on August 15th, so pretty close to that cutoff age. Their families might decide to postpone sending them to kindergarten to give them that growth of that extra year. So that's typically done when their birthdays are so close to the cutoff date. Their parents are worried about them being the youngest in their class. So they're delaying entrance into kindergarten intentionally. So going back to my original question, what do you think are the implications of redshirting in general? Is that implication different from families for lower economic background versus high economic background or children of different gender? So this brings us to the end of the lecture for chapter 6. I will link additional resources and videos that I've talked about throughout this lecture in the module on Canvas. Feel free to check those out and please still refer to your books for more details. Don't forget, quiz on chapter 6 will be due. If you have any questions at all, feel free to email me or message me on Canvas. I will talk to you all soon. Hope you've had a good week and take care.